Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Lasser,
And I'm Gary Kornblith.
and we're talking to you from Oberlin, Ohio, where we have lived for about 40 years. The book we wrote, Elusive Utopia, The Struggle for Racial Equality in Oberlin, um, is really the result of our experiences living in Oberlin for all of these years. When we first got here, we were hired to teach American history at Oberlin College. And we knew as 19th century historians about the illustrious history of Oberlin College as a pioneer in the education of people of color and of women. And we wondered why the town seemed so racially separate for white people and for African American descendants. So it took us a long time to get busy, but eventually we hunkered down to write the book that we'll talk a little bit about today. Um, and we're hoping not to give away too much so that y'all go out and buy the book, now available in paperback. And we are shamelessly hoping to continue conversations with anyone who's interested about what this history of this small town can tell us about the larger history of struggles for racial justice that we're currently involved in. But to start, I'm going to turn it over to Gary, who will give what we have called the Cliff's Notes version of the book. So you have an idea of what it is we worked with. And I'm going to turn on some slides.
Um, so this is the beautiful cover of the book. LSU Press did a delightfully professional job with this. We're very pleased. For the Cliff's Notes version, rather than summarize each of the 9 chapters, I'm going to kind of group the material into 3 parts of the book. The first part focuses on the founding of Oberlin Colony in 1833 as an intentional community, an evangelical Christian community, and then the reconceptualization of its purpose 2 years later, after the Oberlin Collegiate Institute decided to admit students of color alongside whites, which was a radical move for the time. In June of 1835, just a few months after the college had made that decision, a broad cross-section of the town's residents founded the Oberlin Anti-Slavery Society and publicly pledged themselves to support the immediate emancipation of the whole colored race within the United States, by which they meant not only enslaved people in the South, but also free colored people who suffered from the oppression of public sentiment. That's their wording. And the goal was the, quote, elevation of Blacks to an intellectual, moral, and political equality with the whites, close quote. For this time period, this was, again, a radical concept. It was not only that African Americans should not be enslaved, it was that they should enjoy equal rights and that they possessed equal abilities. That was the commitment made by Oberlinians in the summer of 1835. At that time, all of the people making the commitment were white. But over the next quarter century, African Americans came to Oberlin in ever increasing numbers, in part prompted by this vision. Many of these Black migrants were indigent freedom seekers fleeing Southern bondage. Some were freeborn Northerners looking for new opportunities. And others were relatively wealthy mixed-race children of slaveholding fathers. John Mercer Langston, the most prominent African American in the 19th century, fell into this last category. Most prominent African American living in Oberlin, I should say. By 1860, African Americans comprised fully 1/5 of the town's population. compared to less than 1/20th in Boston, New York City, or Philadelphia. Town slide, please. It was a cute little town, but how did it work? We examine how Blacks and whites, where they lived, how they went to school, how they interacted to the extent that we can recover this, that experience at this late date. And by contemporary standards, it was a highly integrated community. In disregard of state law, the town opened its common schools to students of color as well as to whites. Yet even in Oberlin, racial prejudice was a fact of ordinary daily life. Poorer Blacks in particular felt unwelcome in the Congregational Church, the town's foremost social institution apart from the college. Antebellum Oberlin, we argue, was not truly a beloved community, though it aspired to become one. Now, the middle chapters of the book explore the racial dynamics of Oberlin's fight to end slavery and achieve equal suffrage and political power for Blacks during and after the Civil War. When Oberlinians first embraced the cause of abolition in the 1830s, they pledged to employ only peaceful and legal means to eliminate slavery. As good Christians, they had a firm faith in the power of moral suasion. They would bring slaveholders and other people with bigoted views over to the right side with the Lord's help. But that hope gradually diminished. And on September 13th, 1858, in what became famous as the Oberlin-Wellington Rescue, hundreds of townspeople openly defied federal law and intervened physically to rescue a freedom seeker, John Price, who had been taken into custody by slaveholders and government officials. Not going to summarize all of the exciting details of the Oberlin-Wellington rescue, but this is a photo of the rescuers who were held in the Cuyahoga County Jail awaiting trial for violation of the federal fugitive slave law of 1850. Most of them were in jail for over 80 days before return. Hello.
Hi, looks like you guys froze up for a second.
Okay, are we back in motion?
Yep, we are.
Okay, great.
All right, I will resume. We're not at the moment seeing the slides, are you?
No, I think you have to turn screen sharing back on.
There you are. Okay. All right, that was just a short commercial break. In December of 1859, townspeople packed the Congregational Church to honor two of John Brown's men, Lewis Sheridan Leary and John Copeland, both residents of Oberlin who gave their lives in the cause of Black liberation. The support of the town was evident in the response to their deaths. And this marked a kind of culmination of the transition from moral suasion to the acceptance of violence as a mean to end slavery. So when the Civil War broke out, white Oberlin men rushed to participate in large numbers. Initially, African Americans were barred from enlistment in the Union Army, but once they could, Black Oberlinians enlisted in equal proportion to white. After Northern victory, Oberlin activists set their sights on achieving equal suffrage. They met fierce resistance at both the state and national levels. And indeed, Blacks did not gain equal voting rights in Ohio until the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the federal Constitution in 1870. Once that was established, Oberlin's men of color plunged into electoral politics. While most white Oberlinians believed the battle for racial equality had essentially been won, Black Oberlinians knew all too well that the fight continued, but they differed among themselves over how to pursue it. And there was great debate over whether to stick with the Republican Party, even as it retreated from its egalitarian commitments, or to instead pursue an independent political course. The last third of the book examines the growing divergence of Black and white experiences in Oberlin during the late 19th and early 20th century. Initially, Oberlin activists had anticipated that the end of slavery would lead to the end of racial prejudice, and that would open up equal economic and social opportunities for African Americans, who would then rise to economic, social, and political equality with whites, which was part of the original vision. And yet that is not what happened in Oberlin. You have a chart that shows the mean real estate assessments by race of Oberlin taxpayers from the end of the Civil War through the end of the 19th century. And they do not, these lines do not converge. They diverge more or less at different times, but by the end of the period, the average wealth holding of white Oberlinians is greater. The margin of difference over Black Oberlinians is greater than it had been at the end of the Civil War. Why had this happened? Part of the explanation, we argue, is that in the wake of the Civil War, many of the town's wealthiest and best educated African Americans left Oberlin for Washington, D.C. and other cities where they had new opportunities that had not existed before the war. The departure of this talented 10th, we use Du Bois's term here, weakened the collective standing of Blacks in the community, and that goes a good way towards explaining the failure of convergence, but it doesn't tell the whole story because there's another element to it. And let me try to explain, because this is probably the trickiest argument in the book. So in the aftermath of the Civil War, once white Oberlinians thought they had won the battle for racial equality, they turned their attention to the battle against alcohol, which they saw as the moral equivalent of slavery in that it robbed individuals of free agency. But whereas abolitionists before the Civil War had never blamed slaves for their enslavement, temperance activists, sometimes the same people within the town, frequently held drunkards responsible for their intemperance. Moreover, since intemperance was deemed the major cause of poverty, and Blacks were disproportionately poor, Blacks poor Black people were increasingly viewed as authors of their own misfortune. By conflating class, color, and respectability, the predominantly white leadership of Oberlin's temperance crusade promoted the stigmatization of Blackness. By the early 20th century, we can move on from the temperance war. By the early 20th century, race relations in Oberlin increasingly looked like those in the rest of the North. For nearly a half century, Black Oberlinians, at least one Black man had regularly served on the Oberlin City Council, but after 1912, the council was entirely white until the mid-1950s. Residential segregation became the norm, sometimes enforced by legal covenants that barred the sale of rental or rental of property to persons of color, More generally, white Oberlinians were increasingly oblivious to the existence of racial discrimination and complacent in their attitudes towards Black oppression. So in the summer of 1908, a mass trip from Oberlin to the amusement park and resort spot Cedar Point, which still exists as an amusement park today in nearby Sandusky, a mass trip that involved 1,000 people, both Black and white, was reported in the local newspaper with the headline, "Lively Time Enjoyed by All." Yet elsewhere in the paper, there was a small squib of an article that noted, "Oberlin colored people feel aggrieved because they were allowed no privileges at Cedar Point last Thursday. They were not permitted to bathe or get into the hotel or on the dancing floor, as the color line was closely drawn." The paper thought that this was a bad situation, but exonerated white Oberlinians from any responsibility because, quote, "It is a rule at Cedar Point that colored people are not allowed bathing privileges or to enter the dancing pavilion. And the matter was beyond the local committee to secure these privileges for the colored people of Oberlin." Now that is a very different response to racial injustice than the Oberlin-Wellington rescue of 1858. So our book ends in the early 1920s, by which time a color line had indeed come to Oberlin. And what had once been the most woke community in America had evolved into a much more typical, even sleepy, small Midwestern college town. This is not a story with a happy ending, but we think it is nonetheless incredibly important. And I will now turn the floor or screen or both over to Carol Lasser, who will talk about what we see as the big takeaways of this project.
Right, so the big takeaways of this, what we call a post-heroic interpretation of Oberlin history. Why should you care? We think there are at least 4 things to really think about. And, oh, sorry, let's stop sharing. Okay, so we think there are at least 4 takeaways to think about. Some of these may be more important to historians, but I think perhaps they're relevant to all of us as we try and figure out how history, what this history means today. First, as we see it, before the Civil War, it was African-American activists who propelled their white neighbors in Oberlin to increasingly radical strategies to end slavery and work for emancipation and racial justice. To be really brief, African-Americans pushed whites to embrace radical militant methods to end slavery. Why does this matter today? Well, I think it indicates, it signals to those of us white activists that we need to listen to people of color and to follow their leadership. Second, the founding generation of Oberlinians expected slavery would lead to the end of racial prejudice and new opportunities for Black people, right? As Gary's laid out, the 19th century progressed, however, and the residents of color who remained in Oberlin fell further and further behind their white counterparts economically and actually lost political power. Why does this matter? Well, to be blunt, we think of this as in the wake of Reconstruction, racial inequality deepened in Oberlin. And so we need to look at structural racism as we see it in the 21st century and remember that a rising tide does not lift all boats, that racism compounds over time, and that it does not magically somehow follow a march of progress from the bad times to the good. We need to believe in struggle. The third takeaway, by the early 20th century, we know Oberlin was divided by a color line. A major factor in its development was the temperance movement. Now, whites lost interest in the cause of racial equality as they focused increasingly on eradicating the sin of slavery, which they believed, sin of alcohol, which they believed caused poverty. And since Blacks were disproportionately poor, as we laid out, whites increasingly associated Blackness with immoral behavior. Again, the soundbite, the temperance movement promoted the racialization of respectability. Now here, I think it's really important that we enter into a conversation with those who are today struggling to get us to understand that what sometimes look like race neutral policies have very racially specific outcomes. Like the war on drugs, for example. That is, as Ibram Kendi might say, it's not just about the articulated intention, it's really about the outcomes. Racially different outcomes can create racism. Racially different outcomes can come about without intentionality. And finally, our fourth kind of takeaway before we open this for discussion, our fourth takeaway, again, in the land of unintended consequences, we think that at least a part of the explanation for Oberlin's failure to achieve the beloved community envisioned by its founders had to do with the limits of that original vision. Remember, as Gary said, in 1835, anti-slavery Oberlin residents pledged themselves to the immediate emancipation of the whole colored race, as they put it, within the United States, which they defined to include the elevation of African Americans, quote, to an intellectual and moral and political equality with the whites. In effect, the original vision presupposed that Blacks should assimilate to existing white norms. A flawed vision, even then, it does not serve racial justice today. Creating a truly diverse community does not mean that the people in power simply invite outsiders to become one of us. Rather, a diverse community asks each of us to participate in good faith in a dialogue in which we create together a multicultural, multivocal ideal, one that envisions new possibilities for mutual respect and justice. Now, just to wrap this up, yeah, this is a utopian vision. It's utopian, I hope, in the best of ways. We need to dream a better world. If we can't imagine racial justice, how in the world will we ever move forward? So we're ready to open the floor for questions and comments.
Open the Zoom.
Open the Zoom. We'd love to talk with you. Sunny, what do we have?
Great. Thank you both again. Our first question comes from Cindy on the discussion that you mentioned about disparities in real estate values from different races. She asked, have you done any comparisons with today's means real estate assessment? Are there huge differences?
Yes, there are still today very substantial differences in real estate and property ownership in Oberlin. And in fact, we talk about this at the close of the epilogue, if I can find the numbers, because I don't have them in my head. Right now, as of 2000, the median annual income of Black families in Oberlin was 1/4 lower than the median annual income of the town's white families. And the poverty rate among Black families was more than 3 times greater than that among white families.
So I think just to add to that, I've done a little work on the 1940s, and in the 1940s, the average Black owned home, and there was actually a very high rate of Black home ownership in 1940, but the average value of a Black home was 1/3 that of a white home in Oberlin. And indeed, of all of the Black homes in Oberlin, only one was valued at a level that was the average white value. So Black real estate was a much it was a much worse proposition. It was really devastatingly different.
Great. Our next question is about your research process. How do you think living in Oberlin may have changed or influenced your research process in writing this book? Do you think being so close to the subject matter, even living next door to the people that you're writing about, had an impact on you or influenced the way that you wrote?
I think the answer is, of course. For myself, Gary will answer, but for myself, it's both a plus and a minus. You never get away from your research. You're always asking questions. I will say that I have felt incredibly lucky to live within a couple of blocks of the Oberlin College archive. And so when I've had questions, I've actually been able to go back over and talk to my friends at the archive and go back and look at the document. Yeah, I think we feel like we have some skin in the game, to put it mildly. We care very deeply about this community and about how to help us all think about ourselves.
I would add a couple of points. I think we had access to some family resources held within by private individuals that including an important memoir of an African-American ancestor who had escaped slavery and come to Oberlin and lived in the community for decades thereafter. But I will say that we were concerned. We knew that the narrative we were telling, the storyline we were telling, was not the one that either the college leadership or the Chamber of Commerce would want to advertise. And we used to joke in the many years before we were done with the research that, we'd get done, we'd finish, and then we'd be driven out of town. I think it's fair to say instead, we've been really pleased that we have seemingly opened a series of conversations about racial inequities in Oberlin, as well as elsewhere. And that has been quite gratifying because despite the unhappy ending of our history, one of the things that we do believe is important is this original vision can be re-invoked periodically, not just as a cover for what Oberlin's doing today, but as an effort to remind us of how high the community once aimed, and that it's important to reevaluate our day-to-day and not accept it as natural, but instead raise our sights. And so doing it as Oberlin people, as opposed to outsiders, I don't think people reading the book can say, well, that's just what other people say. We know better. We are insiders. And I think we may be heard a little bit more readily as a result.
Great, fantastic answer. The next question actually touches on something that we talked about a bit during our pre-event meeting. What ideas or even lessons might today's activists for racial justice take from the Oberlin story if they hope to avoid similar steps backward? in progress?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I do think that there's a couple of things. One is that, especially in issues of racial justice, white activists really do need to listen to Black activists. Our work predates the prize-winning book by Kelly Carter Jackson, Force and Freedom, in which she talks about how the radicalization of Black abolitionists precedes the radicalization of white abolitionists. I think that for too many people my age, the events leading up to the formation of Black Lives Matters took a lot of, for white people, took a lot of listening to realize that there was a leadership, there was a claim out there that really we had to be following, we had to be thinking about and looking to. So it's one of the lessons that I find is that white allies need to listen and to think carefully.
And I would simply add, the struggle persists, and it is just as racism will evolve and take different forms, so must the struggle against racism. And it's easy to say, well, I did what I could, which is in some ways what white Oberlinians did after equal suffrage for men was achieved with the 15th Amendment. They basically said, we gave, blood, sweat, and lots of tears to this cause. Now we're moving on. But that's not the experience of those who are actually oppressed. And it's important to recognize that the struggle has to be refought every generation, or even every day. Every
day. Yeah. And I'd say one other thing, which I tried to say in my closing, which is utopian dreams are good. Oberlin, when it articulated a commitment, when Oberlin Collegiate Institute articulated a commitment to the education of people of color, people thought they were wild and crazy. Today, that is part of what we think institutions of higher education need to commit themselves to. Things that were once utopian, wild, and crazy, we need to pursue them because they become the standards for justice in the next generation. We got a dream. We got a dream.
I love the optimism. And I agree with you. So for a little more on that kind of utopian idea, for readers who are outside of Oberlin and are just so curious about the town's unique origin story, would you say that there are elements of Oberlin's beginnings as a utopian experiment that still have an impact on the area today, despite the unhappy ending of sorts? Do folks in Oberlin still feel the impact of that unique origin story?
I think it still shapes the way people think about it. And actually, although Oberlin made this unique commitment, the origin stories for Oberlin as a small community in the Midwest, that is not unique. Lots and lots of places throughout the Midwest were formed around the notion of creating a new community, one in which people would work together. What makes the Oberlin story unique is the early on conversion to a notion of radical racial egalitarianism. That notion, I think, still does animate the college, many of the people that work at the college, and parts of the town. I mean, I think our social equity committee of the city council is working these days on plans to recommit the town to this utopian pursuit of a more racially just society. So I think it's a vision we can invoke, and that the community is aware of this special heritage and the responsibility that it bestows on all of us who live here.
Yeah, I think Oberlinians are proud of being outside the mainstream. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily know what river they're on, but now where one goes with that, that's still up for debate, and it's been debated for decades. But the fact that people care that Oberlin is still in certain ways a place where people want to be, that makes a difference. It isn't, just a place because it's the most convenient suburban community to a metropolitan center, for example.
Fantastic. We've got a question from Cindy, who is from Oberlin. And first question is actually about the session. Cindy, to answer your question, the session will be recorded. It's available at the same link that you found this video at. It will continue to be available here. It'll also be on the LSU Press Facebook page under videos. And if you're having trouble finding the link at some point, you can always send a message to the LSU Press Facebook page, and we will make sure that you get the link. So just a heads up to anyone who'd like to watch this after the fact. And then the other part of the question is for you. Will you continue to have this discussion, and how are you reaching the Black community?
Oh, that is a really great question. Really, really great question. Will we continue to have this discussion? I will say with anyone who is interested in having it, we have our college emails. You can certainly get in touch with us and we will talk. As for having this discussion with the Black community, I'm gonna shamelessly promote what is our current project. We are involved with the descendants of Wilson Bruce Evans, who was an Oberlin Wellington rescuer of color, and other members of the Oberlin community, Black and white, in beginning the restoration of Wilson Bruce Evans's home, which currently sits at 33 East Vine Street. The family envisions creating there a museum as well as an educational center where we can talk about Black achievement. We hope that this will be a vehicle that will promote these kinds of conversations. We're reaching out to our to the neighbors on Vine Street, to the family, to Oberlin residents, and we also, I'll take this moment to show and to invite anyone in Oberlin to attend the first annual meeting of the Wilson Bruce Evans Home Historical Society, which will take place at Saturday, September 18th at 11 a.m. in Martin Luther King Jr. Park, right across from the 33 East Vine Street home. So it's our way, I think, of bringing together contemporary concerns and a real respect for what we can learn from African-American activists.
I would also add that we're members, and proudly so, of the Oberlin African-American Genealogy and History Group, and much of its leadership is actually involved in the Wilson Bruce Evans Home Historical Society project. So there is not, a simple singular Oberlin community, and there's not a singular Oberlin African-American community, but I think we are in conversation with major constituencies in our town.
Fantastic. Sounds like a very exciting project. And Cindy also said thank you for its response. So
Cindy, I hope we'll meet you.
So our next question is, it's been 3 years since this book was published in hardcover, and the new paperback edition comes out next month. Can you speak to if and how things have changed during that time? Are there any changes in the paperback edition, or is it just the same book but easier to carry? But either way, can you speak about how things have changed during that 3 years?
Okay, well, first off, it is essentially the same text. A couple of typos were fixed, but we did not undertake a major rewrite or add a new forward or afterword. But it is considerably less expensive than the hardcover was at its launch. How have things changed? Well, when we were finishing up the book, it was right after Donald Trump's election. And I think we were all, at least those of us committed to racial justice, were all in shock. And I think that now we are at least breathing again. Oberlin itself went through a major uproar triggered by Trump's election that raised all sorts of questions about what it means to pursue an anti-racist agenda, this notorious Gibson's case. But I think that what's really different now is that the heroic interpretation of early Oberlin history has been effectively challenged within the local culture. And as a result, I think the discussions of race and of how to achieve a more beloved community have shifted some. That's not all our doing. Some of that is the reaction against Donald Trump and his administration. But I like to think that we have had some effect.
Fantastic. So I believe that is our last question for now. And the conversation can continue in the comment section here. But for our live questions, that is it.
Thank you, Sunny, and thank you, LSU Press, for issuing the paperback. And we look forward to more conversations locally and for people who are struggling with interpreting local histories, but also looking at the national scene.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in for this and put up with some of the technical glitches we had on our end. Yes, we can. Those are my parting words of half wisdom.